Before we get started into our central topic, here are some important definitions you should know.
Alright, let's jump into some definitions. Experimental drugs, a substance that has been tested in the laboratory and has been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, for testing in people. Clinical trials. Trials to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of medications or medical devices by monitoring their effects on large groups of people.
So let's talk about qualifications. When it comes to experimental treatments, there are many qualifications that come into play, and one of those qualifications is lack of alternatives or treatments. If a patient has tried every possible treatment and nothing is taking effect, the patient, through informed consent, makes a decision whether or not they want to try the experimental treatment. The patient is made aware that the drug is not really FDA approved, and it all depends on the patient now whether they decide if they want to take it or not. Another qualification is the patient has to be terminally ill. Patients have to have an incurable and irreversible illness, and they must be at the end of their stage that will result in death in a short amount of time. Another qualification is that the physician has to speak to one of the pharmaceutical companies to gain access to the experimental treatment.
How an experimental drug comes to be. The first step of how an experimental drug gets released to the public is through animal testing. The researchers must show the FDA results of the testing done on lab animals and what they suggest to do with humans. Most drugs that undergo preclinical animal testing never even make it to human testing. A pro of animal testing in experimental treatment is that it goes through excessive testing before it is deemed suitable for humans. The second step is the investigational new drug application. Applicants must list the type of people they plan to use in their study, the appropriate dosages, and the length of the study. Drug studies in humans can begin only after an investigational new drug is reviewed by the FDA and a local institutional review board. They then approve the type of people. Drugs undergo 3 clinical testing phases, and the first one is safety. The number of subjects range from 20 to 80 healthy people. This phase determines the drug's most frequent side effects. A con of experimental treatment is that it goes through only one phase of testing rather than 3 phases like all FDA-approved drugs.
There are many complications with experimental treatments in terms of budget. Patients have difficulty affording experimental treatments since insurances will purposefully not cover experimental drugs because of how expensive it can cost. Pharmaceutical companies can spend from tens of thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars depending on what is being treated. Many experimental drugs are tested to become substitutes for other drugs due to how expensive present ones can be.
In terms of budget, a pro would be that the experiments that do succeed become a cheaper alternative to the expensive treatments. A con is that it is expensive to fund the consistent experiments.
For example, the drug Yervoy, a drug that rallies the immune system to vanquish cancers, costs $30,000 for one injection and $120,000 for a full course treatment. However, only 11.8% of experimental therapies entering clinical tests safely make it to the public. For every potential blockbuster like Yervoy, there are dozens of constant disappointments. In the past 15 years, 10 new lung cancer drugs came on the market, but 167 promising compounds were tested. Similarly, 7 new melanoma treatments were approved, while 96 experimental therapies failed. And companies can burn through millions creating these complicated meds. Go.
A group that has influenced the laws of the government in terms of experimental treatment is the Abigail Alliance. When Frank Burroughs sued the FDA and its commissioner for access to experimental treatment, his goal was to eliminate FDA prohibitions on selling unapproved drugs. This would leave the decision entirely in the hands of the manufacturers. He argued that terminal cancer patients have a constitutional right to have access to treatment before it is approved by the FDA. Though the court initially ruled in favor of the Abigail Alliance, the case was later reopened and the court ruled in favor of the FDA. Its reasoning was that the Constitution never clearly states that people have the right to dangerous, unapproved medication. Even though Frank Burroughs was unsuccessful in his attempt, he brought up an important issue, which later led to the creation of the right to try law. The right to try law allows terminally ill patients access to experimental drugs not yet approved by the FDA. The criteria of the law is that, first of all, it would allow access only to medications that have passed manufacturers' phase 1 clinical trials, which is the first study conducted using human test subjects. Usually, drugs have to complete 3 phases in larger populations before being approved by the FDA. Secondly, the drug would only be available to terminally ill patients who have tried every other alternative. In addition, the medication would only be made available if the company manufacturing it chose to do so. The patient would also need to be diagnosed with a terminal disease by a doctor in order to request the experimental drug. The doctor would have to declare that the drug represents the patient's best chance of survival. Finally, the patient would need to provide a form of signed consent, limiting legal exposure to the manufacturer.
The right to try law is legal in 25 states. These states are Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Massachusetts, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Wyoming, Alabama, Arizona.
Critics of the right to try law have argued for and against it. Arguments for the law include that any hope is better than the alternative of hope, which is inevitable when no treatments are made available for terminal patients. Another argument is that patients should be able to exercise a basic freedom, attempting to preserve one's own life. Burdening a terminally ill patient who is fighting to save his or her own life is a violation of personal liberty. Finally, if a drug has passed basic safety tests, there is a doctor's recommendation, informed consent, and a willingness of the manufacturer, a terminally ill patient should have the option of accessing experimental treatment because more than enough precautions have already been made. However, there are also many arguments against the bill. First of all, it may create a false sense of hope. Secondly, many are concerned that such bills attempt to undermine the authority of the FDA and medical experts in their regulation of drugs. Thirdly, there is a chance that patients will be exposed to the harmful effects of untested drugs. And lastly, some say the bill may be ineffective because it doesn't require the manufacturer to actually give the medication to the patient. The patient may still be refused by the company.
There are many pros and cons regarding ethical sensitivity. The good that comes out of experimental testing is that doctors have a chance to offer hope through doctor-patient advocacy. If a professional in the field of medicine thinks that the experimental drug has a chance at working, then there is something for the patient to look forward to. There are also many support groups out there. An example would be the Abigail Alliance, which was formed in November 2001. The Abigail Alliance is a group that fights for a wider access to developmental drugs for cancer and other deadly conditions. The Alliance is promoting creative ways of increasing expanded access and compassionate use programs. They try to help promote creative ideas to get promising new drugs sooner. Abigail, the founder's daughter, had tried out all of the common cancer treatment methods and only had experimental treatment to rely on. In order to access the treatment, the group was formed. However, with every benefit comes a problem. An experimental treatment can cost a patient their life, and considering the experiment is their last chance, it's safe to say that they don't have a lot of time left. Does the patient want to spend their already limited time as a patient? Also, let's say the worst case scenario happens and the patient dies during the trial. Who will take responsibility in this case of death? the doctor for recommending the treatment, the company in charge of the treatment for the miscalculated death, or the patient for insisting despite the risks taken.
To better understand our topic, here's Jet McSherry's story.
I still can remember saying, kids will develop at their own rate and it'll be fine. It's not like he's going to be 10 and not be able to run. The therapist said, I think he has some sort of muscular dystrophy. And I remember she was kind of hiding the book because she didn't want me to see it. So, but it's just like that. The blood test is quick. So you wake up in the morning and you think your kid's fine, and you go to bed that night and you know they're dying. It was that sudden.
Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a rapidly progressive and fatal disease. With no therapy, these kids don't live into adulthood.
Most young men die in around the age of 19. Jed is turning 18 in October, next month. How do you tell a kid he's not going to grow up?
This case takes place in Boston, Massachusetts. A more detailed definition of what muscular dystrophy does is that it is a terminal disease that tears muscles away, taking away their motor mobility functions, and eventually taking away their ability to breathe. Although there is no cure for this disease, an experimental drug called eteplirsen by Sarepta Therapeutics will stabilize their condition and give them a longer life. However, even though there is a possible cure out there, there are several barriers stopping people from obtaining experimental treatment.
As a cohesive group, we believe that the right to try law should be passed throughout the entire country. We think that patients should have access to experimental treatment as long as enough precautions have been made.
As stated in the Patient's Bill of Rights found in Dr. Joel's book, ensuring that treatment decisions are made by the patient and the patient's healthcare provider is a legitimate concern.
Patients like Jet should be allowed access to experimental treatment as long as they fit qualifications stated in the Right to Try law.